Hi everybody, I wanted to make a quick video just to show you how you should fill out your lesson plan and observational form template. Um, as you can see at the very beginning, pretty straightforward. I made sure to write down everybody's name, grade level, age, the tutoring date, and then the meeting number that we're at. For the assessment portion, I made sure to write down everything possible that I have done with my 2T up until now that will help me figure out what my objectives are and help me figure out how I'm going to present the lesson. We have to remember that assessments drive our objectives, which then drives the way that we present our lesson. The activities that we pick to do with our 2Ts are based off of our objectives, but the objectives themselves are based off of the assessments that we have given. Okay? So you'll notice that for comprehension and fluency, I wrote the exact name of the test within the Eckwall-Schenker, and then I broke it down based off of the results that I got. So I wrote the independent, instructional, and frustration level of the readings, and then I wrote the listening comprehension level. This here already gives me a good indication as to what type of story I'm picking, what type of activities I'm doing, and where my students' comprehension level is, and how I can push them to be a little bit better. For the vocabulary section, I did the same thing. I wrote down the test that I administered, any tidbit. For example, here I wrote that they read up until the 400s within the word list, and I wrote down the miscues. Because now these miscues are words that I can use as vocabulary words to practice. I also wrote down what I got for the graded word list, because this is going to give me a good idea of what vocabulary words need to be taught and what grade level my student is reading at. Okay. So I wrote the independent, instructional, and frustrational level, and I wrote the miscues within each section. For the writing portion, I wrote the prompt that I gave, and then I wrote what my 2T actually wrote with all of the mistakes. And then here I wrote, he needs to practice capitalization, spelling, and sentence structure. So now I know when I get to my lesson portion, these are the areas that I'm going to be covering. Now that we had our assessments and we wrote everything down, I can go look for my standards. Okay. So my standards are related to the results of my test. Now, keep in mind, my student is reading roughly around a 4th grade, even though he's a 5th grade. That's okay. I'm still going to pick a grade level standard. My standard's still going to be within that 5th grade, because whether he's there or not, that is what we're working towards. So my first standard is by the end of the year, Steve is going to be able to read and comprehend literature, including stories, dramas, poetry, etc., at this complexity. So I'm going to be practicing the comprehension levels within this complexity, and hopefully I can get him from that 4th grade level to the 5th grade. Same thing with vocabulary. I picked those grade level standards, and I related these to my assessments. I looked at the need of my student, then I looked at what they need to know, and based off of this comprehension test, vocabulary, and writing test, now I'm making those standards and finding them as appropriately as I can. Once I have my assessments and my standard, now I can get to my measurable objectives. A good tidbit would be, is this objective measurable in the sense that by the end of the tutoring session, and by that I mean like by the end of week 10, can I go back, pick one of these objectives, and see if there was growth? For example, if I wrote Steve will be able to compare and contrast, and that's it, at the end of tutoring, how am I going to see that growth? It'd be pretty hard because it's not measurable. You didn't give a baseline as to what needs to happen. So for example, here I wrote, Steve will be able to compare and contrast 2 similar stories by providing 2 comparisons and 2 contrasts. So in the future, if I want to revisit this objective, now I can say, can Steve compare and contrast with 3 comparisons and 3 contrasts? It lets me measure what they were able to do within the time that they were with me. Same thing with the vocabulary and same thing with the writing. Please notice that I'm not writing here any activity that I'm doing. Your objectives, the way that I always think of it is, can a student understand what they are working on that day? If I sit here and write, oh, they're going to read this story and use this diagram and blah, 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 it becomes very convoluted. Make it simple, yet measurable, and based on your assessment data. For your lessons and lesson material portion, please note I wrote down everything that I needed, even if it was the most minimal of things. I even went down to the slides. In this slide, I'm going to have this diagram. In my next slide, I'm going to have this. This is good practice. So when you're in the classroom, you're very aware of all the materials that you're going to need. If you go down to the sequence of lesson, let me zoom out a little bit so you guys can see how I broke it down. I have my introduction, my evaluative comprehension, because compare and contrast goes under the evaluative comprehension portion, my breaks, vocabulary, and writing. I wrote down step by step what needs to happen. The way that I think about it is, if a substitute were to come to my class and grab my lesson plan, could they follow my lesson in a way that they're not going to be confused or do something that I didn't ask for them to do? It's going to be very step-by-step, very detailed, so that anybody who grabs your lesson plan can know exactly what you're doing at which part. So notice that I wrote tutor A and tutor B, and then I made sure to distinguish. Tutor A is going to present the lesson, and my tutor B is going to write down the observational notes. Okay, so this is my introduction. For my evaluative comprehension, I wrote down every step that I will front load, I will respond, acknowledge, ask. These are the verbs that you need to be putting into your sequence of instruction. What will you be specifically doing, and what do you expect your tutee to be doing during these times? Okay. I added my breaks, my writing, and then my final goodbye. Okay. For this evaluation and reflection portion, these are just some of the questions that I think are very important to answer. What went well? What could have gone better? Do you think your tutee was receptive to your lesson? Were you able to complete it? And what are you going to work on next week? Definitely, you can go into more detail. Use this section, especially now that you have a co-teacher, to talk to each other and think, okay, now that this is what happened during this lesson, what can we work on next week? And what can we pick up on, or maybe change, or never touch again, in case you found something that just truly didn't work. So this portion is very important as well. So your lesson plan should look something like this, very detailed. It seems very nitpicky, but trust me, in the long run, it will help you be a little bit more organized. And to pair this with your observation report, we can switch over and put our observation hat on and think, okay, now I'm tutor B and I observed my co-teacher teach. I wrote down all the important information, and I'm going to give a very honest response to what I think happened. So if you noticed, I went down and I marked X to the places where, I felt my partner was at. If you notice here in the emerging, and mind you, emerging isn't bad. Emerging just means that we're learning. We're learning new ideas. So don't feel bad in writing those emerging portions. So you'll notice the text is appropriate for the lesson objective, and the student has access to the test. So I wrote 2 because maybe my tutor A was picked a story that was a little bit too high, and I saw that my tutee, struggled a little bit with it, or maybe there was a little glitch to where we both couldn't see the text, etc. For this portion, I definitely, I did it on purpose. You'll notice right here, I didn't put a wrap up. So I have to be very honest and candid with that and say, there was no wrap up and there was no restating of literacy objectives. So these are important tidbits to remember. As advice, what I would do is once I'm done writing my lesson plan, pull out your observation report and look at these sections and think, okay, did I address these in my lesson plan? These are very good steps to have within that lesson plan. Once you go down here, you're going to just tally up how many X's in the categories your co-teacher received. And then this is very brief, something that I wrote, but this is a good place to evaluate and reflect and be very honest. You can say, the student was engaged. He seemed very happy to be here. But then you can say, at one point, Astrid forgot that she didn't add that slide and she had to quickly add it. So it would be very candid and then very, honest and detailed as much as possible, because this helps. Being reflective helps when you're writing a lesson plan or you're revisiting a lesson and thinking what could have gone well, what could I have improved on. Okay, so this is a very rough, overview of how you're supposed to fill these out. I hope it does help. I will be adding this lesson plan and this observation form examples on Blackboard. Please make sure to go look for them. And if you have any questions, definitely reach out. Have a great weekend, and I can't wait for tutoring to start.